And welcome back to Frankly Speaking. I'm your host, Frank. Let's call this part 31 of Mussolini, an Italian American perspective. Okay, guys, tonight I want to go back to the very beginning, and that is, about 3.5 years ago now, when I started diving deep into the studies of Benito Mussolini, Italian fascism, World War II, all that era that has been really a fascination with me. And with me, it started when I was a young man in many ways because my father, who survived World War II, my father was born in 1935 in Sicily. And one of one of the main reasons why I became a history major and a history buff was because of my father and the stories he used to tell me about the war. And I've kind of come full circle and have found my sort of my breeding ground, if you want to call it that, with World War II and that era of history, especially with the Italian side of the war. And so a few years back, when I was kind of first venturing around different circles, I was starting to gravitate away from sort of this Protestant classical liberal ideology that has encompassed America. I was looking for, different points of views to kind of find myself as an integralist. Was I a monarchist? Was I integralist? Was I, what ideas? How do we deal with Catholic governance, especially in a post-liberal society? And I started listening to Trad Patrick, Rights and Duties, who started talking about Mussolini a whole lot, and it was quite strange to me at the time listening to him, but Trev Patrick, he was really a hoorah kind of a Mussolini guy, and he was saying a lot of interesting things. And I would listen very closely to him. And for me, it was just like, well, it was a revelation because I was raised in that mindset that the Italians were always the bad guys throughout history, especially, well, in that period history, World War II, right? Because America and the Anglo Protestant empires went in to liberate these sort of thuggish, fascist nations who happen all to be Catholic, mind you, not right. I mean, we could debate about Germany because Germany was half Protestant and half Catholic, but it sort of has been a contradiction, and it's a contradiction that a lot of Italians don't like to talk about. We don't talk about it because especially here in the States, when we immigrated here, listen, we had our loyalties here. We always were good citizens here. We kept our heads down, and a figure like Mussolini, Italian fascism was vanquished. But it was always interesting to me is how an Italian nation, how a Catholic nation, can turn to such a, what would we call it, a tyrannical ideology, an authoritarian ideology that is sort of an anathema in Western liberal republic. And you mix this with the sort of abstract Christianity that sort of the liberal republics of the West have embraced. You're like, okay, well, they all must have just gone batshit crazy one moment in time. And listening to Trad Patrick back in the days, and I know there's some controversies around Trad Patrick, his old show Rights and Duties, he put a different perspective on it. And it honestly, it raised a curious thing in my mind to think to myself, maybe I have to research this a little bit closer, see what this really is. And I started diving deep into World War II, Mussolini, Italian fascism. Listen, and listen, when you study Mussolini and Italian fascism, you're inherently going to go into looking at the Nazi side of the war as well, too, right? We differentiate those two because Italian fascism and Nazism were different. In many ways, again, Mussolini never liked Hitler, but because of geopolitics, they were forced into this camp together. And of course, as I said so many times before, for all the things I say about in the positive of Mussolini, his alliance with the failed Austrian painter was his greatest failure. I've covered that before, and we'll cover that again in more detail later on. But what was fascinating was when I started to become curious about Mussolini, Italian fascism, and what life was like in Italy. Now, remember, I already had exposure to this. My father was born and raised in fascist Italy. Well, he was a young man, a young boy he was, right? I think the war ended in, 40, call it 45. He was born in 35. So he's about 8, 9 years old. He's telling me stories. But my father was the youngest of seven siblings. So all of his brothers, which were all my uncles and aunts, all grew up, were raised in that period history. And of course, I had my grandparents on my mother's side that raised a family, or they were a young couple at the time, going through fascist Italy life and what that was like over there. And my grandfather, at one time within family circles, kind of family rumors, was quoted to say that Mussolini was the greatest leader Italy ever had. And now for what reason I don't know. My grandfather passed away many years ago, and unfortunately, I didn't ask him why. My family is not a family of intellectuals, but my general sense would be of the strength and the security and the unity that Italian fascism brought, a sense of strength to an Italian nation that was really struggling after the Risorgimento, right? Just simply making Italy into what Italy is. And so to me, that was what was fascinating. So I got this kind of, positive response to my family. We never got the horror stories from Italy, like you say, like from the Soviet Union, where they built walls to keep people in. You never heard the stories of, the people jumping over the Berlin Wall, being shot in the back, or jumping into shark-infested waters trying to escape Cuba. That never happened in fascist countries, at least not in Italy. It didn't, right? When Italians left, they left by choice, and usually it was because the country was in economic turmoil and people were looking for a better way of life because, again, a nation that was underdeveloped, highly agricultural all the way through World War II, Italy could be in a tough spot in terms of its economy, right? And so the stories we got were actually good stories from Italy, even in that fascist era. The families were strong, they were vibrant, the faith was alive, culture was rich, history, tradition, sort of this pedigree that kind of makes you whole as an Italian or as a Sicilian as I am, and a certain sense of security about a national or a familial or a personal identity that I've actually never felt as an American, right? Because in America, we believe in these abstract ideas. You do you, I do me. And as long as we don't cross each other's property lines, we don't shoot each other. Which, okay, fine, we got this greater governmental structure thing that we follow about property rights and making the money in America. But when it comes to the really deep issues that builds the soul, builds the heart, builds the mind, builds the family, in America, we take a pass on that. That's all a personal choice, and you can believe whatever you want to believe. And which is, I guess, fine to a certain extent, but don't be shocked when you have a soulless society that's all divided and ripped apart because we have no common values, no common morals, no common standards, no common beliefs, no common religion. And I think this is one of the things we suffer through as Americans and why Americans always suffer from an identity crisis, right? I think the best we do as Americans is, well, we all make the money, right? I climbed up the corporate ladder. I got my stock portfolio. I got my 401k. I'm making the money. I made manager this company over here. I bought a property. Okay, I'm doing good in America materially. And in that sense, materially, America has been a success to a certain degree. I will say that. Better than a lot or most European nations. But for me, a curiosity grew, and I was searching for something online. I said, you know what? Let me look into this Mussolini thing. And, I was thinking about getting my first book. But of course, you know, I realized very early on that because of our animus toward fascism, it was going to be difficult to find something that was fair and balanced, that gave fascism a fair shake in history, right? Listen, if it was a tyrannical, diabolical, system, I'm willing to throw it under the bus. I was always willing to throw it under the bus. But at the same time, I kind of wanted more the Italian perspective on it to see where it came from, what its origins were, what its ideas were, and not a simplistic, sort of Americanized Protestant Anglo perspective on what fascism was, because I've seen this within the realm of Protestant theology in America and how we never take anything seriously, things of a deeper purpose or meaning, and again, leaving us to these shallow, principles of limited government principles that I can agree with to a certain degree, but they don't build the foundations of who you are. And I was searching the internet looking for a book recommendation, and I ran across an article was it? I believe it was the Huffington Post, USA Today. It was a liberal rag of sorts, and they were quoting Steve Bannon of all people, right? The guy that sent Trump up to the White House in his first term. He's a pundit now. He's a populist and kind of right of center guy. I like Steve. He's pretty cool. I think he's Catholic and all that stuff. And Steve had been reading a book on Mussolini, and the book was Nicholas Ferrell's Mussolini: A New Life. And I read the article. The point of the article was to diminish the ideas of Steve Bannon, because they're a bunch of liberals, and the point is, see, look at Donald Trump's top guy. He's a Mussolini fan. Well, I wouldn't say Steve Bannon is a Mussolini fan, but what he did say, what he was quoted as saying, was that, listen, Mussolini did some good things in Italy, and he had read Nicholas Ferrell's book, and he recommended it to people. And I'm like, okay, that's interesting. And before I bought the book, I researched the author, Nicholas Ferrell, and Nicholas Ferrell was a writer for the American Spectator in Europe. I'm thinking to myself, okay, right of center kind of guy, probably classical liberal type, something like that. But giving Mussolini a chance, is that really the case? Because again, we're raised in this little world, right? And you do a simple search on YouTube, type in Benito Mussolini, and everything is just a horror story, right? The tyrannical ruler, the man that destroyed democracy, did all these terrible things. Of course, he's Hitler's right-hand man in one of the greatest wars in history. And when you ally yourself with the most evil man in history, of course, you're going to carry that, right? That sort of stigma with you. And so never is, again, the idea of fascism, because it runs counter to our liberal values, given a chance in the eye of history, unless you're willing to find somebody who's going to give it the time of day. And so I said, okay, all right, listen, I really went in, and I've told this to several friends of mine, when I went to study sort of the life of Mussolini, Italian fascism, that era of Italian history, I really went in there to discredit it all, right? I'm like, this guy, Track Patrick, but listen, he's full of it. He's missed something along the line. This is crazy stuff. I mean, this is tyranny, right? This is oppression of freedom and liberty. This is all that's horrible about life, because, freedom and liberty rules. Now, don't get me wrong. I was already seeing, problems at the time, as I had shifted to integralism with sort of the principles of liberal democracy. But certainly Mussolini, a fascist, wasn't the answer. So I at the recommendation that I saw in this article by Steve Bannon, I decided to order the book, got it on Amazon, and I started reading. And the reason why I bring this up is because what really, but really, how should I say this, enamored me to really go through with this is really the opening, not chapter of Ferrell's book, but it's the actual forward of the book. Now, he starts with acknowledgments, and he acknowledges here, and this is important, there's different schools of thought on Mussolini and how we study him, right? And Nicholas Ferrell addresses the issue that he goes with the writings of Italian historian Renzo de Felice. And the reason why he goes with de Felice is, unlike a lot of other historians, he uses the facts. Felice had access to the government documents after the war, and Felice was actually a communist at one time. That's the interesting thing about it. And while Felice is not, I don't think, glorifies Mussolini in any kind of way, he gives him a fair chance. And that's the problem with the liberal order, that has to create a narrative, right, post World War II, to justify that liberal order and everything that comes in the West after World War II. And so it's fascinating. And he starts with the acknowledgement, and then we get to the forward. And this drew me into the book right away, and it helped me confirm a lot of things that I've been hearing from guys like Trad Patrick back in the day. And let me read the forward to you. It's not very long, but it's very interesting how Ferrell addresses the start of his book. Now, the book is fantastic. It's very long. It's comprehensive. It's very fair and balanced, right? It blames Mussolini for his errors and his mistakes, but as you hear in the forward, a lot of it is also liberalism, again, that has given him an unfair sort of shake in the eyes of history, because there was, let's put it this way, Well, I'll tell you what, let me read it. And I don't want to spoil anything because the forward in this book is excellent. Here we go. Let's see, page 2 of Nicholas Ferrell's book, Mussolini and New Life. Quote, Mussolini was one of the most talked about figures in his age, and most of that talk was favorable. Pope Pius XI called him the man sent by Providence to save Italy, the American ambassador in Rome, Washburn Child, the greatest figure of his sphere and time, and Churchill, the Roman genius. But history is written by the victors, and once Mussolini became a loser, his place as one of the very bad men of history was guaranteed. Those victors who believed in free will, Western liberals, dismissed him as a grotesque buffoon, and those who did not, the Marxists, wherever they lived, as a mere tool of the bourgeoisie. Both were wrong because neither view explains how it was that Mussolini was able to get power and hold it, by and large, bloodlessly, for 2 decades until his disastrous alliance with Hitler, or why for so long there was no resistance to him inside Italy and so much praise for him outside. Quite apart from anything else, Mussolini began as a left wing revolutionary, and he could not stand the bourgeoisie. He was also a brilliant journalist, and you only have to read an article by him to realize that he was no buffoon. We live in a post communist times, and there are signs that we are moving into post democratic times as well. So perhaps the point has been reached at which it is possible to try to set the record straight. When Mussolini abandoned socialism to found fascism as an alternative left wing revolutionary movement, he lived in a time of even greater uncertainty than our own. Fascism, the so called Third Way, seemed to offer a viable alternative to both democracy and communism. Mussolini did away with democracy, but he did not, like most dictators, use mass murder to retain power. There was no need. He and fascism had mass appeal because, unlike democracy, especially Italian democracy, they got things done. And unlike democracy, they transformed politics into a form of religion, from an isolated act involving the ballot box to a daily act of religious faith. Mussolini was as popular with women as men, if not more so. Behind every great man, it is said, there is a woman. Behind the great dictator who had 169 lovers, according to one estimate, stood a nation of women. They were attracted by his masculinity. They were even more attracted by his politics. Such was the great magnetism of both Mussolini and fascism that the only honest verdict must be that he ruled with the consent of the Italian people. Mussolini's fatal error was his alliance with Hitler, whom he despised. But this alliance was far from inevitable because fascism and National Socialism were like chalk and cheese, as were the Italians and Germans. Italy and Germany did not even share the same strategic aims. The Pact of Steel resulted more from Mussolini's fear of Hitler than from any wild desire for world domination, let alone the extermination of the Jews. Just as none of the victorious powers went to war with Germany to save the Jews, neither did Mussolini go to war with them to exterminate the Jews. Indeed, once the Holocaust was underway, he and his fascists refused to deport Jews to the Nazi death camps, thus saving thousands of Jewish lives, far more than Oskar Schindler. It was only when he started losing battles that any resistance to him from within Italy worthy of the name began to form, and despite what the post-war myth would have us believe, this resistance was largely irrelevant factor in the liberation of Italy. Once the liberation had happened, however, its communist dominated elements were responsible for the slaughter of 35,000 Italians without trial, who joined the 15,000 Italians slaughtered by Tito's communist partisans in northeast Italy, slaughtered not because they were fascists, but because they were Italian. One of the aims of this book is to encourage the reader to consider whether Mussolini had better vision than Marx. For as communist ideas appear internally ill, the fascist state of the Third Way lives on and is championed by the standard bearers of the modern left, such as the New Labour Party in Britain. This might surprise some, but to some, that fascism was a phenomenon of extreme right is to deny Mussolini's vision. He despised the bourgeoisie way of life, la vita comoda. Above all else, he remained at heart a socialist to his dying day. In Italy, barely a day goes by without discussion of Mussolini in the press or on the television. Since the re-election of the media tycoon Silvio Berlusconi as prime minister in 2001, such talk has increased as its focus has moved out of the realm of national soul searching and into the political arena, with the left shouting fascism at Berlusconi's every move. But if dictatorship is to replace democracy in Italy or anywhere else in the West, it will be something quite different from the government of Berlusconi, a mild Thatcherite, let alone fascism, though it will be undoubtedly contain a potent religious cocktail as a core attraction. Most people presumably would agree that democracy, despite its faults, is the best political system on offer. But I have lived in Prepadapio for 5 years, where Mussolini was born and is buried like a minor deity. And when I see a beautiful young woman doing the Roman salute in front of Mussolini's tomb, I realize that she is yearning for something. And I know that whatever it is not democracy. This book, I hope, will above all make the reader wonder about the nature of good and evil and how difficult it is to tell them apart. Mussolini was a great man who failed because, as he himself only too aware of the nature of dictatorship, for as he said just before his death, quote, have you ever seen a prudent, calculating dictator? They all become mad. They all lose their equilibrium in the clouds, in the quivering ambitions and obsessions. And it is actually that mad passion which brought them to where they are. Mussolini was not a good man, but nor was he half as bad a man as he has been portrayed, and certainly was not an evil man. End quote, Nicholas Ferrell, written in Prepadapio in 2003. Prepadapio, um, that's the hometown of Mussolini, where he's buried. Ferrell's book was written in 2003. Can be found on Amazon and other sites if you guys are interested in it. So when I got the book, this one here was my very first book on Mussolini. Now I have a whole library of Mussolini books. I have at least, I don't know. Well, Italian history, fascism, Mussolini books, I probably have over 2 dozen now at this point, as I've done is read on the matter now for a little over 3 years. And this being my first book and reading that forward, it really drew me in right away because I started to realize that maybe a guy like Trad Patrick wasn't so crazy. Um, because it really does address here, and what touches me the most is the struggle that I was going through a few years back as we were watching the liberal democracy of the West collapse on top of really the great apostasy and the fall of Christianity. When he says there at the end, when he sees a young lady doing the Roman salute, you know, she's looking for anything but democracy because it's not fulfilling, especially in a country like Italy, where democracy was artificially imposed after the war with, again, the values of the Western Protestant liberal republics, because we believe that our way is the best way and we can oppose it all over the world. And democracy has been very flawed in Italy. That's why they've had the problems that they've had over there for a long time. But I bring this up only because, you get to a point in life where, at least for me, I'm not afraid to admit the mistakes I made in the past. I'm too old, I'm too sick now at this point in my life to hold on to a bunch of ideas that don't seem to be taking anybody anywhere, especially in America now. Listen, I get it. Donald Trump was just reelected. He came into office a couple of weeks ago, and everybody has this sort of false hope this honeymoon period, right? This fake peace, I guess you want to say. That's gonna buy some time, and it's like a temporary reprieve until the left recalculates and ultimately gets back into power and picks up where they left off. Because that's really been the history of democracy. That, and I guess the point that Nicholas Ferrell was making there is that wherever you look across the West, democracy is a left-leaning ideology, and it's brought us to the brink of something that's very unfamiliar by first and foremost by killing off our Christian sort of pedigrees, our Christian roots. And then bringing about moral depravity, and with that then comes the political and the cultural depravity that seems to be haunting the West now. And some people are fed up with it. I know I got fed up with it about a decade ago when I started to revert out of classical liberal ideologies that have all of its shortcomings in so many ways. I mean, even with this Donald Trump thing that's going on right now, and everybody's happy about. We'll see what the end results are. One, it's all a bunch of executive orders, and if a lot of stuff isn't done legislatively, it's all going to be brought back. But number two, we'll see what the effects are and how serious, um, you know, we do this. But at the end of the day, it's like I tell my friends on the right, don't count the left out. The left will rise again one day. Right now, they are waiting in the weeds and they are calculating they'll get back into power at some point because the system is flawed. And I think this is, again, going back to the forward, he says, listen, the fascists got things done. And that's pretty much the truth of what happened in Italy. And in many ways, I think that's the only way you can truly govern, not through a consent of the people, but through a system where, and this is what fascism does in Italy in those days, it takes into account the culture, the standards, the history, the traditions, the faith, and it comes up with a comprehensive ideology for it to govern by and dictate by. This is what fascism tried to do, and this is why it conformed to the Italian way of life. It's why there was no uprooting the system. It's why there was no serious rebellions against Mussolini in his time in power, especially when Mussolini brought the church in through the Lateran Accords, because Italy was, what, 98, 99% Catholic at the time. You bring the church in, it was a smart political move by Mussolini. He knew he couldn't govern a Catholic nation without the church. Now you say, well, it's a political calculation. Maybe it is, but we also know that Mussolini was coming closer and closer to his faith in life. Mussolini was as close to an integralist leader as we've had probably ever in the past century or two, at the very least. I know a lot of Catholics don't like to deal with that, but there's some reality to that. And again, we dismiss Mussolini as a grotesque brute because of that alliance with the failed Austrian painter, which is something I've dealt with in the past. But Italian society was strong, it was vibrant at the time, and it wasn't perfect, trust me, it was far from perfect, but it also wasn't attacking the soul of the nation. It conformed to what Italians were and what they believed, especially in faith and in culture and ideas, and it tried to encompass those things. See, in the West, especially with the liberal republic, our liberal sensibilities are immediately offended as soon as we break some, libertarian economic principles. But again, society is more than just an economic theory. And while I may agree that certain elements of market economics are healthier than some more controlled mechanisms of the economy in any society, there's still an imbalance in the sort of the market system, and that's what the fascists understood, right? And while the liberal republics of the West were all consolidated under oligarchs, it was the fascists saying, no, we're not going to allow these particular banks or loan sharks to come into our office and enslave the nation and its people. And that's what offended a lot of the sensibilities of the Anglo-Protestant republics. And see, I guess for me, I've become much more malleable in my political theory because at the end of the day, you have to be able to govern. You can hold a theory all you want, and you may believe that your theory is the greatest theory in the world because you figured it out in your mind. But if you can't govern, and this has been the Achilles heel of the political right, if you can't govern, then all your theories don't mean nothing. And this is why the West, led by America, has been perpetually going to the far left. What the fascists figured out was we may have to limit certain things in order to keep order, but we will find an equilibrium of sorts to help us all sort all of this out. And economics does not supersede the culture. It does not supersede the faith. It does not supersede the family. That these other, what do you want to call it? These other things that are so vital to society have just as much equal weight as an economic theory does, right? But then again, I don't expect much from the liberal republics because that's the only thing we focus on, right? Is economics, making the money, making the money, making the money, right? This is sort of that libertarian streak. Well, everything else, when it comes to family, when it comes to culture, when it comes to history, when it comes to tradition, the pedigree, that's all irrelevant in the West, in the liberal republics. We've vanquished those under the guise of constant rebellion. And this is why you look at around and the culture and the family have absolutely been obliterated in modern times with no hopes anywhere really to fix it anytime soon. And so we double down on the sort of the economic thesis that we believe is going to bring heaven and earth, when in fact, all it's ever brought is more Marxism, ironically enough. Now, while fascism was born of liberalism, without a doubt, is influenced by a lot of socialist thinkers, without a doubt, it is a deviation of sorts to the right, as it tries to deal with some foundational issues in a real and meaningful way. It doesn't throw out custom, history, tradition, culture, and faith, all for economic prudence, right? Economic viability. And ultimately, that economic viability in the West has all become corruption, as we're now finding out, ironically enough. Um, the first of which, of course, is once you vanquish the moral law, as we have in the West, under the guise of freedom of religion, once you vanquish natural law under the guise of freedom and liberty, well, your economic thesis don't mean nothing if you don't have a moral people, right? I know many conservatives are so proudly to proclaim one of the founding fathers, who was it? Jefferson, I believe. Was it Adams? I forgot now who it was. Well, the Constitution was made for a moral people, so we got to get back to biblical principles. But do you realize how radical the founders were in their religious beliefs? Do you realize that? And when you have a polarity of religions, how do you find common ground? Because if your theology is disordered, your culture is going to be disordered. If your culture is disordered, your family is going to be disordered. And if family is disordered, then politics becomes absolutely corrupt. Simply acknowledging that we need proper morality. And ironically enough, America being a nation founded by Freemasons in many ways, that also preach the idea of morality, but they don't care for the source of that morality, right? That morality can be Buddha, that morality can be the Protestant Jesus, it could be whatever you want it to be. And that's why ultimately what America believes, what it believed at its origin, wasn't traditional Christian morality. It was stoicism, is what it was, right? Be a gentleman. There was some abstract concepts of morality that kind of worked. It worked because we were coming off the heels of Christendom. Let's be honest here, right? And people still believed in the faith, and Protestantism, as it was becoming kooky and very separatist, right, was still holding on to a lot of the old values of Christendom, which was governed by the Catholic Church. But as the fumes of Christendom has sort of vaporized throughout time and history, here we are. None of it makes sense anymore now. And so, and this is, I think, the pedigree, the history, tradition, the fascists were trying to find again, you know. Um, so I don't know. I just, again, just get back and wrap this up. When I got the Ferrell book, it just struck me that forward. And from there, you see what Ferrell does in the book, and he gives Mussolini as a historical figure a chance. He says, listen, Mussolini made some mistakes. Might have not been a good guy, but he wasn't necessarily a bad guy, and he certainly wasn't evil. And that is really the polar opposite message we've gotten as Americans when we look at World War II. And again, we, as Americans, we play that morality game, right? Which is a tradition of the British Empire, right? We are better because we are morally right. We are morally just. The guy we're fighting is evil, right? That's the war propaganda, right? I get it. That's why every war we've been in as Americans since World War II, it's always Hitler, right? Saddam was Hitler, Noriega was Hitler, Gaddafi was Hitler. Everybody we fight is Hitler. Putin is Hitler, right? That's sort of the moral metrics we use. And it's also a psychological operation, is what it was by our government to get us to conform and accept these wars because you need a population. You have to give them reason to accept these wars. And so when you combine that with the corruption of the media, and then years later on, we find out that some of these wars we fought in were kind of dubious, questionable information, questionable intelligence. You begin to wonder, holy crap, what's going on here, right? Right? So I don't know. I don't know. So for me, that's where it all began. It began with Ferrell's book. I highly recommend it. And from there, I went deeper into stuff. And Ferrell lays out a great case, again, using the Renzo de Felice methodology. Now, I get it. A lot of liberal and communist historians don't like Renzo de Felice. They don't like him. Renzo de Felice also wrote a book on, what was it called? The Jews in Fascist Italy, which was heavily critiqued by modern sort of university professor types that criticized him for that because Felice, who was Jewish, ironically enough, wasn't harsh enough on sort of the Italian authorities at the time, especially after Mussolini passed the 1938 discrimination laws. But it's interesting to me because the 38 laws, we could talk about that some of the time, but the ultimate point is Felice isn't liked by far leftists, but you got to consider that. You got to consider the camps that everybody falls into. And just like in American politics, you have your left and right that exists in Italy today, and it exists in a historical context because the communists and Italy was ripe with communism after the war because there was no fascist movement to tamp down the communists. Communism rose and took a foothold in Italy. It's one of the reasons why Italy's had a lot of systematic problems ever since the end of World War II, and why this government has all been kind of unstable over there. Remember, the Communist Party was making a push to take over the nation until our State Department colluded with the mob and the Vatican in order to make sure that didn't happen post-war. You know, two elections in 46 and 48. Now, I've heard disputing evidence of this. I read one book that said that the communists were about to win the election. I've read another source saying the communists were not about to win. But regardless, the fear was real. So much so that our State Department had to go in there after the war. And in doing so, the mob was revived in Italy because of that alliance, and the Vatican got into some shady dealings as a result of that. And the Vatican suffered with much infiltration after the war. And again, this is when we get into the deep problems of the church, the deep church issues. And since World War II, really the world has been off balance. I mean, listen, you could go back to the French Revolution, is where it started, but as I said before, and I think the point that I always try and make is the rise of fascism in Catholic nations was a last desperate gasp for Catholic nations to protect their nations, their civilization, their culture, and their faith. I don't believe World War II was a narrative of good and evil. I believe it was a clash of civilizations. And I believe that it was the last death nail in Christendom, the old Catholic world, that Catholic world that actually built the West, that gave us the moral compass. The great achievements of the West achieved under the Catholic Church and under the Catholic faith. And without an effective Catholic Church post World War II, the West has been dying off. And none of this is salvageable anymore, as Americans are desperately clinging to this abstract Jesus through Protestantism, which never, ever works, of course, because Protestantism was never the true faith founded by our Lord. Um, mm, the West goes where the Catholic Church goes, and we're on the brink because the church it has been infiltrated, and there's diabolical orders there. But as we know, our Lord will rise again one day, and the gates of hell will never prevail against his church, as he promised Peter in Matthew 16. I believe in that promise, even as confusing things are. And fascism, say what you want, the church worked with the fascists. You know, what's interesting too is that, you look at the church's writings, it clearly condemned communism. It actually condemned certain elements of capitalism, but it never condemned fascism. And even as Nicholas Ferrell quotes in his book, Pope Pius XI called Mussolini a man sent by divine providence and awarded him the highest award that a layperson could ever receive in the church. What is it? The Scepter of the Holy Cross, I believe is what it is. Most people don't know that. And so it's interesting how Italian society at that time it contrasts from Italian society today as everything has become infiltrated with liberalism. And see, for me, it's especially interesting because my parents came here in 1960. So the stories, or at least the vision, the ideas of Italian culture and the stories I got from the old country were, an Italian society in the 40s and the 50s when my parents grew up there. But after the war, my parents came here, and as American liberalism went into Italy, it altered the culture there. It brought the same types of moral depravity that we have all throughout the West. And with that, Italy has suffered many of the same problems as the West, as we have in America today, because American liberalism does that. Again, democracy forced upon artificially an Italian nation that I don't think was ever ready for democracy. We never needed it. Catholic nations, again, we've never begged for democracy, right? And this is what I think most classical liberals don't understand when we talk about things like, for example, the founding of America and rebelling against the tyrannical monarchs and freedom, liberty, and the oppression. You're dealing with Protestant insecurities. You always have to remember that. Catholic nations didn't have those same kinds of problems. Most of the monarchs were pretty good to its people, not perfect, but pretty good to its people. And Catholics were never begging for democracy like the Protestants were, because ultimately democracy feeds the rebellious nature of Protestantism. And just as Protestantism rebelled against the church, now these Protestant societies are ready to rebel against their monarchs, right? And if you look at American society, it has been nothing but a succession of rebellions at every level with the culture and the family and everything that goes with it. We've been doing that now really since the founding, and everything has broken down. And again, I would argue it's because America, without the Catholic Church, never had a chance. It never had a chance. Protestantism just continues to devolve. It continues to break down. I mean, just look at sort of, you know, how all the mainline churches, when America was founded, they're all practically gone. They're practically irrelevant now. And new flavors of Protestantism are always forced to sort of uprise in order to save Protestantism from a complete collapse. And this affects America adversely as well too. But let's see. I think that's it. Mussolini, A New Life by Nicholas Ferrell. It was my first book that I read on him. I want to go back to the beginning, give a little refresher how this series started. I'm going to continue to dive deep into this topic. It's something I'm fascinated with, something that, again, was part of my youth as a kid, my family, all that stuff. I'm going to go as deep as I can. I'm not that smart of a guy, guys. I consider myself a blue collar kind of intellectual. Well, I'm not an intellectual. My point is, I just work hard at what I do. I have a passion for it, and I'll continue to present to you a lot of these ideas and these stories and this history, as long as the good Lord is willing to give me the health and the ability to do this. I would ask you to pray for me. I'm fallen just like everybody else is. I want to thank you for joining me. This is Frank signing off for Frankly Speaking. Good night, everybody.